about the basics of arrays, so what it does, what it looks like, how to access it, how to change it, and we also went through a bunch of methods that comes pre-built in with arrays that just make it a lot easier for us to use arrays to do something, right? So before we had our traditional for loop, which we could use to loop through an array. Yesterday we saw a few other tools that help us either add or take away elements to the beginning or the end of the array. We talked about slice, which is able to create a copy of the array. And then we also talked about a few search functions like index of and includes that helps us search through the array. During the workshops, you did a few problems on basically rebuilding the functionalities that those built-in functions do. And for us, the reason for that is just because we wanted you to really fully understand how it works underneath the hood, and also to show you that those functions are not that complicated, right? When we use them, we take them for granted, but really there's no magic going on there. You could build them yourself, but just because they're so commonly used, the folks who made JavaScript said, "Hey, let's just kind of prepackage it in and make it an out-of-box solution." So today we're going to talk about a few more functions in that vein, and then we'll also talk about a little bit more of an involved usage of arrays. Okay, so yesterday we talked a lot about adding and removing elements from the beginning and the end of arrays. So that's your pop, push, shift, and unshift. One thing we really didn't talk about that is probably a very common use case also is what if I want to actually add or remove something from the middle of the array, right? So not just from the beginning or the end. And that's where this method called splice comes in. Just so you know, it's also very easy to get this confused with slice. And even when I use slice or splice, I usually do a really quick Google lookup just to make sure that I'm using the right one and I don't get my arguments confused. So really the short of it is splice helps you edit the original array by either adding or removing elements from the middle. Or if you want, you could also use it to add or remove things from the beginning or the end. So really this is a more kind of comprehensive function, if you will, compared to some of the ones we did yesterday. Just like most other functions, splice takes in a certain number of arguments. The first thing it takes in is an index. That's basically where do I start. The second thing is also a number, and that just tells you how many elements do I want to take out. And then as we'll see later on, you can also add in another argument that tells you what if I want to put something else in there in its place. Okay, and what it returns, very much like .pop or .shift, is when you do use it to remove a bunch of elements away from an array, well, the return value of the splice function is going to be all the elements that were just removed in an array format, right? So what splice does is it edits the original array by adding or taking in things, by adding or removing elements, and what it returns is all the elements that were just removed. And if you don't remove any elements, then it will just give you back a blank array. So if I take a look at line 11 there, right, I create this variable called single term precedence, and I do names .splice. I have two arguments here. The first one is 1. The second argument is also 1. The first one basically indicates, hey, start at index 1. Index 1, if you recall, means position 2, right? The second element in the array, which in this case is John. And the second argument is going to be how many things should we delete from that argument. So if I take a look at what the output is, if I want to start at John and I want to delete one element starting from and including John, well, that basically says take away John, right? So after I do that on line 13, when I console.log out names again, I get back George and Thomas, right? I took away John from right in the middle. But if I look at what the output of the splice function was, right, which I captured in line 11 there in the variable single term precedence, I see an array with one element, which is John, right? So this is basically a combination of all the functions we talked about yesterday, except now we're actually able to also specify not just where we want to start editing, where we want to start removing things, but also how many elements we want to remove. If I keep going and say, hey, I want to do this now, but I want to remove 2 elements, same exact idea. In this case, on line 3, I am starting at index 1 or position 2, so George, and I want to remove two elements, which is George and John. And then when I take a look at the original array, after I call .splice, the original array has two elements removed, and the return value is the two elements that were removed. Lastly, splice can also be something that you use to add elements at a given index. So in this case, on line 5, what we're doing here is we're saying, if I look at the arguments, right, the first argument is 2, which basically means starting at position 2, or sorry, starting at index 2 or position 3, right, the third element, which is Pete. Take away one thing, which is going to be Pete, and replace that with Ringo. So now when I console.log out the original array, I see that I essentially deleted Pete, right? So it was Paul, George, and John, and then I added in one element where Ringo was. Sorry, where Pete was, which was Ringo. So now my original array reads Paul, George, Ringo, and John. And then if I look at the return value of the splice function, it gives me back an array with one element, which is Pete, which is the element that was removed. Now, if I want to use the splice method just to add elements in, very quick and simple. All I gotta do is pass in a 0 as the middle argument, right? Say go to this position, take nothing away, but add these things, right? So JavaScript so the splice function is totally cool with that, and that will be a way for you to add elements into the middle of an array. Ta-da! And then, as you can tell on line 5 there, the splice function is pretty fickle about the first two arguments. Basically says the first argument has to be where I start. The second argument has to be how many elements you want me to remove. But after that, it can take in as many elements as you want to, as many arguments as you want to give it. And each of those arguments is just going to be something for you to add into the array. So once again, in the example here, I start in position index 2, so position 3. So I want to start where Ringo is. I want to take nothing away, and I want to add in Pete and Stuart. So now, if I was to actually take a look at my if I was to take a look at my original array now, right? I still have my Paul and George, and then starting from where Ringo used to be, I added in Pete, I added in Stuart, and then obviously Ringo and John are still there. So my original array now has 6 items, and if I look at the elements that were removed, well, that 0 on line 5 there tells me I didn't remove anything, so therefore splice just hands back to me an empty array. And that's pretty much it for splice. Any questions? This will be the most complex, I guess, array method that we're going to cover in this curriculum. Yep. No. If you don't want to, if you don't store that value anywhere, then the computer calls it, and then it just kind of. The short answer is no. You can think of it conceptually as it just kind of goes away and disappears. The more technical answer is it remains somewhere in a computer, but then it'll get cleaned up. If it will get cleaned up eventually. So for our purposes, you can just think of it as, yeah, if you create a value that you don't store it, then eventually it just disappears, and you have no way of getting access to that value. Cool. And did you have another question as well? Cool. All right. Yeah. Just we can come back to it in a little bit. Are there any other questions from anyone about the splice function? Yes, and we'll actually talk about nested arrays later on in the section. But basically, for that third argument, you can put in whatever you want there. Here, we put in a, a string called Pete. You can put in an object there. You can put in a number there. You can put in a boolean. Whatever you put there, that is basically what element we'll be adding in. Yeah, so it's It doesn't have to be a string. It can be any value, including another array, if you want it to be. Cool. Any other questions? Felix, are you ready for us to come back to you, or should we hold off a little bit longer? Yep, totally. Awesome. All right. So just moving on, we have a few other methods to cover. One of them is called the join method, and the join method basically does something that's a little bit kind of it's a nice helper function, almost like a nice way to do something that's more of a shortcut. It basically takes all of the elements in the array and it will join them for you into one string. So if I take a look at this array here called names, if I do names.join, I literally, all this function does is it will take all of the elements in the array, it will join them for you into a single string, and it will insert a comma between every single value. Notice what this does is the join method gives you back a brand new string, right? If I take a look at my original names array, which I guess we don't do here, but it does not change the original names array. All it does is loop over it. It takes every single element and creates a new string out of it with every single element separated by a comma. And so in the example here, you see us call names.join with on line 6 there, right? And we call it with an open and closed parentheses, and we pass nothing in, which basically tells JavaScript, hey, put a comma to separate each value. However, if I wanted to put in something else, for example, in this case, if I want to put in space and space, like I do on line 3, whatever I pass in will then override that comma and be the new separator. So if I do this now, I will get Paul and George and John and Ringo. Essentially, this is just like a handy way for us to take a list of things and convert it into a string, or more commonly, we just use it to convert something into kind of more of a human readable way to represent an array. Right? If you think about like if you were on a website somewhere, if the computer gives you back an array of like maybe all of your errors, it can look kind of funky. So then they might just say, oh, let's do a dot join and separate the comma, so the user can kind of see a list of all the things in a way that's a little bit more user friendly, I guess. I think there's a question somewhere. No problem. Yeah, it's gonna get really messy, is what I can tell you. So let's just say I have something like this. Key value, I have 9, I have 0, and I have David, right? For this kind of monstrosity of an array, if I just do x.join, what I'm gonna get back is something that looks kind of like that. And it's technically not incorrect when you convert these things to a string. That is what they become, but it's just not very human readable. And so in general, when people use .join, you kind of do it with the assumption that the person who's using the array knows that typically there's only going to be either booleans, numbers, or strings in the array. Like JavaScript won't break if you try doing it with a null or an object or an undefined or another array, but it will print out something that probably looks more like gibberish than something that's more useful. Yep, no problem. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. And then the other thing to do is, well, if I know I want to take everything in an array and join it into a string, that's very easy. But what if I actually want to combine multiple arrays? Here's where we have our handy concat method. And all concat does is it merges two or more arrays into one. So here, if I have one array called older, one array called younger, and I want to join them into one array with 4 items instead of 2 arrays with 2 items each, well, I just got to say create a new variable. So I store that value and I use it and I do older.concat younger, right? And so the most common place where people get tripped up with the use of this particular function is they just call older.concat younger, but they don't store that value anywhere. And to Felix's point earlier, whenever a method gives you back a new array or a new string and you don't capture it or you don't store it in a variable, well, eventually it just goes away, and you kind of lose access to it, right? In this case, all we're saying is, hey, let's take this one array, concat it to another array, and we'll give you back a brand new array. But most importantly, we're not going to change any of the original arrays. So in this case, because we are returning back a brand new array, we have to store it in a variable somewhere. But it's also considered a very safe function, right? Because we're not mutating the original arrays here. So this is just a handy way for us to concatenate or join together multiple arrays. And this will only go kind of one layer deep, if you will. And so I'll show kind of a different variation of that, or what the implications of that once we talk about nested arrays. Okay, so we talked when we first started the section on arrays, we kind of noted that, hey, arrays can hold any value, numbers, string, booleans, but it can also hold any value, and that obviously also includes potentially other arrays. So if I take a look at this array here called related things, notice how, and to the human eye can be, it can be maybe a bit tricky to see at first, but that's not an array of 4 things. It's an array of 2 things. It's an array of 2 elements. And each of those elements is in another array with 2 more elements in it. So if I was to say, hey, grab me the first element of related things, it's not going to grab me Windows. It's going to grab me the array Windows, Mac OS, right? And so here's where we get into this idea of chaining, whereas to say, rather than just kind of doing one operation one at a time, well, if I know, for example, on line 5, related things index 0 is going to give me back another array, well, if I want to access the first element of that array, why not just put another parentheses after, or put another bracket notation after it? Because I know JavaScript's going to evaluate the code going from left to right. So when I look at line 6 there, if I say related things, that's an array, give me the thing at index 1, right? Give me the second element, and I say, great, it's an array of New York, Chicago. And I say, great, now give me the 0th index, or the first element of that array. Well, the first element of that array is just the string New York. And now here's a way for us to access that array, first access that element without having to say, well, related things index 1 equals x, and then x index 0. Here we can just kind of go straight. Obviously, this is something that works, but you also want to be careful you don't kind of go overboard, right? If you have an array that's nested, several layers deep, if you do related things index 1, index 0, index 4, index 2, index whatever, it may work, but to a normal human being, it's also incredibly hard and tedious to read. And so while this is a handy thing for you to use, just kind of don't go overboard with it. If you're the author of the code and you're like thinking, oh wow, sometimes I get confused about which layer of nesting is which, then I guarantee you the reader's definitely going to get confused, right? So while you are able to use this, typically you don't see people use this past 2 levels, right? 2 levels is pretty much the max. After 2 levels, people say, okay, you probably want to store, some of this in a temporary variable and then use a temporary variable going forward, just so your readers have a better sense of what they're looking at. And then lastly, just to kind of drive the point home, once again, if I take a look at related things, that is not an array of 4 elements, that is an array of 2 elements, because each element can be anything including another array. And so that's why that array.length is going to give me 2 instead of 4. With a nested array, it doesn't mean every single element has to be nested, right? In this case, we have an array called RSVP groups that's combined of both arrays made up of strings and other just direct strings. Here, if I use one of my for loops and I go through it on line 4 there, here's where I am using to here's where I am using a temporary variable called element to just kind of capture temporarily what whichever element I am looking at. And then here's where we leverage the array.isArray function we talked about yesterday to determine whether or not something is an array, right? Remember how we can't use type of for arrays because type of arrays is technically JavaScript, or sorry, in JavaScript is technically object. So that's a little bit confusing because something could be an object or an array, and we can't really tell the difference. Array.isArray is by far the easiest way for us to do so. And remember that isArray also gives us back a Boolean value, either true or false. Something is either an array or it's not, right? There's not much of there's no middle ground there. And so in this function, if I just do if array.isArray parentheses element, that implicitly is telling me if array.isArray element returns true, so if something is an array, then on line 6 there, look what I'm doing. I'm just creating another for loop now for me to go inside that inner array and go through every single element in that array. Notice how I can't use I as my index variable anymore because I've already used index I on line 3 there, right? And generally speaking, if you use I here, it actually might still work, but it's also just incredibly confusing for someone else to read your code because they don't know which I you're talking about. So normally what people do is they just kind of go one letter up. So if I used I on my first loop on line 3 there, for the second loop I'll just use J, right? And then if I have one more loop I'll use K, etc., etc. And then so once I'm inside my inner element, notice how between lines 6 through 9, the array that I'm looking at is called element, right? Because that's the element that's on that I initially created on line 4, and that basically tells me, hey, if the element is an array, handle it this way. Otherwise, just console log out element. And now by doing this, what this is going to enable us to do is actually go through this entire array, and regardless of whether or not the array inside of it is going to be an array or an array made up of strings or just a string, it's going to be able to go in and print out every single element. And so this is just kind of an example for you to take a look at to understand how you should approach nested arrays. They are accessible, but sometimes you need to do a little bit more work. And once again, you just need to be a little bit more precise about how you access each single element within the array. And so the last application then of nested arrays is something that that is a little bit more visual. Is this idea of a grid, right? If I want to say create a 3x3 grid, well, that's pretty much one way to represent that data format. Is pretty much just to say, hey, a grid is just an array of arrays, right? If I want to make a grid of 3x3, that's basically just 3 rows with 3 elements in each, right? Right now, between line 7 and 11, when we print that out, we're kind of spacing it for you in a certain way to make it visually a little bit more easy to see. When you print out on a computer, it will most likely just print out on one continuous line. So when you make it, like when you console log it, it may not visually look the exact same way that you think it might visually, but conceptually it is the same exact thing, right? All we're saying here is in order to create a two-dimensional array, to create a two-dimensional grid, that's basically just an array of arrays. That's just basically a bunch of rows, and with each rows we have an X number of values. So that would be so this is a code way for us to represent a grid. And so if I was to want to access any of the rows, well, that's easy, right? To access any of the rows, it would just be grid index 0 or grid index whatever row I want to take a look at. Because if I look at line 7 through 11 there, row 1 is just grid index 0. Row 2 is just grid index 1, and then row 3 is just grid index 2. Okay. If I want to look at each column, on the other hand, it's a little bit more involved, because what I actually need to do is I actually need to go through each single row and say, hey, give me your first element, right? Take all those values and put that into another array. And that's exactly what we did for you there on line 13. If you take a look at this variable called first column, we see that we're creating our own array, right? We see the outermost brackets there. That means we're creating our own array. And in that array, we're putting in 3 elements. The first element is grid index 0, column, or sorry, grid index 0, index 0. That basically says go to grid, get me the first row, and get me the first value in that first row. The next element in our first column is going to be grid index 1, index 0. And that says go into the grid, get me the second row, and get me the first value. And then likewise for the last element, we say go to grid, get me the third row, and get me the first element. That basically gets me all of the first elements, and when I put all that into one array, that gives me back the first column. So this is just another way for, when people usually ask, well, when do people ever use nested arrays? This is one example of the types of applications for nested arrays when we're trying to show something maybe more graphically or via kind of more of a two-dimensional relationship. After today's workshop, in addition to today's workshop, after it's over, I'll also open up one of the optional projects I mentioned on Saturday. Optional projects, as the name indicates, are optional, and the one that you want to, if you want to work on, it will be around basically making your own Sudoku validator. Sudoku is a game that's played on a 9x9 grid, and so all we're basically asking you to do is, hey, clearly, if we want to do a grid, we know how to represent that via a nested array setup. Why don't you create a tool that will actually help you check to see if a given solution for Sudoku works? Okay, so that was a kind of a quick and dirty on nested arrays. Once again, it's something that you will see, but by far the more important thing is just to understand when you do see a nested arrays. If you do want to go through and access every single element in the array, because the arrays are now nested, we just want to kind of really emphasize the point that just means you need to go into each array and then go into each element in that array, right? You can't do it in one step. It has to be a two-step process. So, any questions? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, so not in class. Usually what I'll say is like if you want to write the code and then send it over to me, I can take a quick look and just kind of give you some feedback. And if you want to put it on like a REPL link and send me the link via Slack or just paste the code to me in Slack, that usually works. But we're not going to be dedicating any class time to reviewing the solution, although it will come with a solution. Yeah. Yep. All right, cool. So I'll let you all get started on the workshops. I will let you keep the same partners from yesterday, assuming your partner is still here. If not, I will put you in a separate room. I know we didn't exactly get all the time we needed to finish the workshop yesterday. So sorry, I'm just gonna stop.